Hey there, y'all. Welcome back. Okay, we're going to be moving on with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We're moving on to Book 2, Chapter 1, that sovereignty is inalienable. So Rousseau says, by definition, the sovereignty is the will of the people, and it cannot be wrong and is inalienable. So he makes this distinction. He's saying this is a sort of philosophical assumption that we are making, right? The true sovereign is inalienable, but the people can move away from true sovereignty. He says, I hold then that sovereignty, being nothing less than the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and that the sovereign, who is no less than a collective being, cannot be represented except by himself. The power indeed may be transferred, but not the will. Okay. He also takes a pretty socialist stand on the assumption that the general will always be towards equality, right? Um, he makes this real assumption that the general will is equality. And I would say, segregation in America and other places would suggest otherwise. I think maybe he would make the point that that's not the true sovereignty, right? And we'll get there. But anyway, okay. He says, for the particular will tends by its very nature to partiality, so to the individual, while the general will tends towards equality. How would we treat sort of the golden rule? The people cannot simply give themselves over to complete obedience, right? So this is antithetical to Hobbes again, right? We are not meant to be completely obedient, right? He already states that like slavery is not an acceptable transaction between God and man or between man and man. And so in that sense, complete obedience is antithetical to freedom, according to Rousseau, which is sort of anti-Hobbesian. Uh, he says, if then the people promises simply to obey, by that very act it dissolves itself and loses what makes it a people. The moment a master exists, there is no longer a sovereign. And from that moment, the body politic has ceased to exist. Okay, chapter 2. That sovereignty is indivisible. So you'll see here we're using some of the same words that the American Constitution uses, right? Inalienable, indivisible, blah blah blah. A lot of this philosophy really influenced the American Constitution writers, the writers of the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton was a little bit more enthralled with the Hobbesian arguments. Jefferson was more of a sort of Rousseauian, but they all saw the need for checks and balances, the need for the people to be involved, these sorts of things. Okay, chapter 2, that sovereignty is indivisible. And he basically just says here that Grotius is mistaken in confusing the institutions and laws of sovereignty from sovereignty itself, which is the will of its people. Rousseau also calls Grotius an ass kisser who was trying to suck up to the king of France. And so he's like, look, y'all, Grotius had incentives to be a sycophant to the king, just like Hobbes did. So don't take his words too seriously. So I thought that was really funny. Okay, chapter 3, whether the general will is fallible. He says the people are often manipulated into acting against their own self-interest, right? He says, quote, our will is always for our own good, but we do not always see what that is. The people is never corrupted, but it is often deceived. And on such occasions only does it seem to will what is bad. So the people can be corrupted. And so, from a modern economics perspective, it would be the idea that leaders tend to have full information while citizens do not. And so, leaders and media, etc., can manipulate people's beliefs about what is real and what is not. And we're seeing that in just a macro sense right now with social media and TikTok, Facebook, etc., where nobody seems to know what reality is anymore. And that's when things get really bad, according to Rousseau. He says the general will is merely the average of all the citizens' wills, right? And that wills can be aggregated into factions, and then the votes of individuals don't matter, but rather the will of the factions themselves, causing deviations from the perfect general will. So this is what they're talking about in Madison number 10, the Federalist Papers number 10 and number 51, which are very, very famous Federalist Papers written by Hamilton and Madison just before the Constitution is signed, to convince people that um, factionalism or parties are anathema to a good democracy. Uh, and so that's basically what Rousseau is saying here. He's talking about the same factionalism that they were talking about in the Federalist Papers and warning against. And he's saying, once people start getting sort of shunted into parties or factions, then it's the factions themselves that drive things, right? The Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And the citizens themselves don't really have much say anymore because they're being so manipulated. And then he also argues that multi party systems are far more amenable to the general will than a two party system, as that makes it simpler for one to take control and deviate the general will by capturing the state. So we do actually see this in modern political phenomenon and in modern political statistics and research. We know that multi party systems tend to be they tend to be more equal and egalitarian. Uh, they tend to be a little more centrist. They tend to um, have higher taxes and higher welfare distributions, so that there are fewer really, really poor people. They have a lot fewer hyper rich people. So everything just sort of is a little bit more fair. And those systems also tend to be longer lasting. And so while the United States is a two party system that's very long lasting, if you look at sort of the history of the world at presidential systems and two party systems, most of them have existed in South America, and we're very, very fragile, and we're taken over by militaries. Um, and so it's really interesting to see him make this point long before any of us had any statistical knowledge about multi party versus two party states and their characteristics. So, yeah, really, really, really cool stuff from Rousseau here. Okay, we're going to call it there, and then we'll move on to chapter 4 of book 2 on the next lecture. All right, thanks for being here.